Over the last 2 or so weeks, former Federal Reserve Chairwoman and current U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has made a lot of public comments about inflation being a good thing. She has talked about how inflation means there's a healthy economy, how inflation means there's more consumer demand-driven inflation, and also how inflation means that the economy is doing so well that interest rates are going to go up. But a lot of this is complete and total BS. This is all part of the stagflate tax lie narrative. She is admitting that inflation is going to keep surging, although I think the U.S. government will start to change the consumer price index. We had hedge fund manager Kyle Bass do an interview on CNBC in the last 24 hours talking about how if the consumer price index was not using phony chained CPI data, if it was unchained, Kyle Bass says the real inflation rate would be 12% right now, which is very similar to what John Williams of ShadowStats has and also the Chapwood Inflation Index. So just more narrative control, false narratives that inflation is actually good compared to deflation. If you study Austrian school economics, you know that deflation is actually good for people who have savings and don't have debt, because then they get to buy more consumer goods, more assets, and they have more purchasing power. So you can read some of these quotes here from Janet Yellen that I've amassed over the last 10 or so days. It is pretty ridiculous how delusional the people in power are. Meanwhile, and I've covered this for a long time with Janet Yellen, her and her husband, they're worth over $10 million that they've disclosed on financial disclosure forms. Her and her husband have at least half a dozen pensions combined from their different times in academia as professors and Janet Yellen's terms inside the Federal Reserve and then getting promoted to chairwoman. And then also the speaking engagements where she was charging $250,000 or more to give talks to hedge funds or financial institutions like BlackRock or investment banks. So people like Janet Yellen, who have this type of job security and extra payoffs and pensions and are benefiting from asset price inflation, the Cantillon effect, with stocks, bonds, and real estate, they're not going to care if they're paying an extra 10, 20, 30% for stake or their bills go up a little bit, because they've made so much in net worth off asset price inflation. And unfortunately, the majority of Americans don't own a lot of assets, but for delusional champagne socialists like Janet Yellen, who is a bleeding heart liberal, she's a labor economist. Labor economists actually don't believe, despite the 1970s stagflation, that stagflation is possible. They believe that stagflation is not possible because you can't have high inflation without high employment. So stagflation, which is high inflation plus unemployment, without wage growth, without labor increasing, is impossible, according to labor economists. So the economics profession, these PhD economists, they are causing insane amounts of problems. They really just give governments, politicians, and bureaucrats the justification needed to do whatever they want. And that's why things have spiraled from more traditional Keynesian economics to neo-Keynesian and now to MMT. It is all a justification for big government, politicians, and bureaucrats to get away with whatever they want, with rules changes and goalposts moving, whether that's on the GDP formula, the inflation formulas, and the unemployment formulas. Finally, if you like content like this and want more in-depth content than the short little free videos, please check out my Patreon. There is almost 170 articles, charts, and audio podcasts behind the paywall, including 12 new articles out in the last 5 or so weeks. And there is also a 45-minute audio interview with Sandstorm Gold CEO Nolan Watson that is exclusive just for patrons. I think it is one of the best deals out there. And unfortunately, Google AdWords revenues running on these videos that I make don't pay the bills. My patrons pay my bills, so there is a lot more in-depth content on global macro research and individual companies and sectors behind the paywall. Strongly consider becoming a patron. It is the cost of a bad cup of coffee per month, and if you don't like it, you can always cancel. But I think you're really going to like the content. I put a lot of work into it. There is many hours worth of content behind the paywall. Some of those articles behind the paywall, I spent many hours researching and writing.